Three Dragons Media presents the Ridgeton Tales. Chapter 1 Many Chance Encounters by Ian Oliver. Magnus dug his nails into the wooden railing as his stomach burned with an arcane fury begging to be unleashed. He opened his mouth and released the chaos of his morning meal over the port side of the puddle jumper. He had been assured that the journey from Eldrin City to Ridgeton was quicker and more relaxing if taken by sea, albeit more expensive. The sickness caused by the endless rocking of the boat had not been mentioned as part of the price. Magnus slumped down and leaned against the railing, letting the salty sea wind blow across his sweating brow. He had no more half-digested offerings left to give the fish. Magnus looked out across the small top deck of the ship and saw what at first he thought was an elf, though his ears were much smaller than any elf he'd ever met. The small-eared elf was peering off the front of the vessel and looked to be muttering to himself and touching his chest. Was he praying? As if sensing Magnus staring, the elf turned and looked directly at him. It was in that moment that Magnus realized he had met this elf before, in the libraries of the Academy Arcana in Eldrin City. Magnus stood up shakily and walked over to the elf, hoping conversation might distract him from the churning in his stomach. "Greetings. I wasn't meaning to stare. It's just that I believe we've met each other before. A few years back, we were both attempting to find the history of necromancy in the Tameless Shore, 610 to 675. Magnus had always been able to remember small details. It was in part what made him such a strong student at the academy. The elf suddenly looked at Magnus, as if seeing him for the first time, and studied him for a moment. Oh yes. I believe I do recall that. You must be that dwarf wizard that caused such an uproar with your admittance." "The uproar caused at my arrival at the academy was a whisper compared to the one by my father at my departure." Magnus said this with a chuckle. The elf stared at him for a few moments, and then gave a half-hearted smile, as if he didn't understand what Magnus had said was meant to be a joke. "Well, you look about as sick as I feel. First time traveling by sea," Magnus said after a short pause. "Oh, no, I've traveled on ships plenty. I'm just lost in my thoughts, I'm afraid." "Ah, well that's a state I'm well-traveled in. Allow me to accompany you on this journey through our thoughts, and let us speak of them together, and perhaps find our way." With that, the once tense shoulders of the elf seemed to relax, and he gave a slightly broader smile. "I'm Keldos, cleric of Syak." "Excellent. Magnus is my name. Tell me, Keldos, cleric of Syak, can you heal me from this accursed seasickness?" The puddle jumper arrived in the port of Ridgeton just before dusk on the third day of their journey. Magnus had overcome his sickness, however he was still weary and longed for a full meal and solid ground. Magnus and Keldos, whom we learned was half elf and half human, had spent most of the journey together. Keldos had divulged to Magnus that he was attempting to find his father, and that he heard that he was last seen near Ridgeton. Funny that while his companion was desperately trying to find his father, Magnus was frantically avoiding his own. Keldos agreed to accompany Magnus for the night, and Magnus was glad for it. He may need to lean on his new friend to help him through what awaited him here in Ridgeton. Ridgeton was considerably smaller than Eldrin City, but noticeably larger than any town in the Bronze Hills, where Magnus spent the first 30 years of his life. The portion of the city by the docks was a long row of mostly wooden buildings that generally seemed in good shape. It looked to be mostly markets, fisheries, and factories. Several lampposts dotted the long street, and the lamplighters were just beginning their work. A larger portion of the town was located on the top of a bluff overlooking the docks. The majority of these buildings also appeared to be wooden, with a few gray stone structures randomly mixed in. A large wooden wall that looked to only be half completed was being built to surround the elevated half of the town. The duo spoke to a town guard and were told where to find the Crow's Nest Tavern. This was the agreed-upon location where Magnus would confront his destiny. As they made their way through the town, it struck Magnus how little he had truly seen of the world. To the dwarves in the Bronze Hills, he would have been considered well-traveled, but that was only because any dwarf that left the Bronze Hills was considered to be well-traveled. Magnus had only ever been to Eldrin City, where he met travelers, adventurers, and thinkers from all over, but much of his time over his last 10 years in the city had been devoted to studying at the academy. Magnus suddenly realized that he really knew nothing, aside from what he had read, about how the world truly worked. It was because of this that his master, Thephalocius, had advised him to leave the walls of Eldrin City. "Your knowledge of the arcane and the theoretical is astounding. However, your application of this knowledge is severely lacking." It was a polite way of telling Magnus that he was a great student, but a shit wizard. The Mages Guild would never accept a wizard of such little renown and practical skill, no matter how high his test scores had been. After a short walk, Keldos and Magnus arrived and stood outside the Crow's Nest. Magnus paused, staring at the door. The tavern was 3 short stories high and twice the width of the buildings on either side. There were few windows, and the entire place looked as if it was held up by a spell and one of Keldos's prayers. Magnus took a deep breath and flattened out a portion of his royal blue robes. He ran his hands through his jet black hair that he had placed in a single long braid, which ran halfway down his back. He lifted his head high and narrowed his eyes toward the door. Inside would be the first true test that he would face on this journey. Are we going in?" Keldos asked, shocking Magnus out of thought. Without another word, Magnus pushed open the door. Light, smoke, and the odor of long spilled ale escaped the musty tavern as Magnus and Keldos walked into the Crow's Nest. The sights and smells immediately brought back memories of Magnus's upbringing. All that was missing was a fistfight, which, given the appearance of the place, was sure to happen soon. Magnus took a few steps in and scanned the room. The tavern was full of people, many of whom looked to be dock workers and laborers. At one table he noticed 2 elves, one wearing all black, and the other was barely wearing anything at all, but the individual Magnus was seeking was nowhere in sight. Keldos began whispering in a low voice. "Who exactly are we meeting here?"
"Brother!"
A booming voice shouted from Magnus's side as he felt an arm wrap around the back of his neck and pull him to the side.
"Hammers and stones you've gotten skinny. Years of reading books and making sparks jump has softened you too much."
Magnar, Magnus's older brother, stood with a giant warhammer slung over his shoulder as he upended a pint and threw the mug to the ground.
"It's good to see you, Magnar. It has been too long."
It had been 15 years since Magnar had left the Bronze Hills to join the Rising Suns, a group of mercenaries that operated throughout the Tameless Shore. Their father's anger at Magnar's decision to join the mercenaries was eclipsed only by his ire at Magnus's own choices.
"Drop the fancy city talk and grab a pint. It is a bad day for ale, for Magnar and Magnus are reunited."
Magnar wrapped his arm around Magnus's shoulder and began leading them to a table at the far end of the bar. Magnar suddenly stopped, turned around, and Magnus could see his brother's grip tightening on his warhammer.
"Can we help you, small ears?"
Magnar asked Keldos, who had been following closely behind. Keldos took a half step back and looked at Magnus, who was stumbling to find his words.
"Oh, brother, this is my companion Keldos, cleric of Sayak."
Pleased to meet you, sir. If you would allow me to sit with you, I should like to buy us all a round of ales," Keldos said shyly. Magnar glared at Keldos before smiling wide.
"Any bearer of the gift of ale and beer is kin to me for the night. Come, cleric, and sit with us."
When they reached Magnar's table, the barbarian tossed his warhammer onto the top of it. Magnus believed the hammer may have had a weightless charm placed upon it, judging by how effortlessly his brother wielded it. The hammer landed with a loud crash, and the table creaked under its massive weight. Magnar sat down and upended another pint that had been waiting for him. His red and blonde hair, which he inherited from their mother, was twisted into several long braids that hung nearly to his waist. His beard was long and unkempt, with some portions matted down and others soaking in spilt liquor. Magnar wore only dark green pants and a pair of leather suspenders. His muscles were bulging, and the scars that marked his bare chest and back told 100 stories of pain and glory. Magnus and Keldos sat as the barmaid brought 5 ales. Magnar took 2 of them.
So, your little teacher tells you to go exploring a bit, and you think old Magnar can show you a thing or two. Is that it?
Well, if there's anyone who could get me into some sort of trouble that may take a little magic to get out of, I could think of nobody better than you. Magnus had only exchanged a few letters with his brother over the last 15 years, but Magnar actually had become well-traveled. Plus, he had recently left the Rising Suns and would be free to join Magnus. Having Magnar's warhammer might come in handy as well. Magnar let out a thunderous belch and slammed his fist onto the table.
I'm sure I can find us something to do, Sparky, but I don't think small airs here is the getting into trouble type.
Magnus glanced at Keldos, who was still slowly sipping on his first ale. A large plate of bread, cheese, and smoked fish, as well as several more pints of ale, arrived moments later. Magnus had not had ale in quite some time. In fact, he had convinced himself he didn't even enjoy it anymore. Drinking was a common pastime for scholars and mages alike. Many a breakthrough in the world of scholarship was said to have been discovered in the bottoms of empty glasses. However, deep red wines were usually the lubricants of choice to get those wheels of philosophy moving. But being around Magnar again and hearing his brother laugh and tell tales, that made the ale sweeter than the finest wines he'd ever had. Magnar and Magnus quickly devoured the platter of food and ordered another. Magnus attempted to keep pace with his brother's drinking, but the task proved impossible. He had truly become a professional drinker, even by dwarven standards. Keldos ordered wine after finishing the ale he had bought for the table, and mostly listened to the 2 drunken dwarves as they spoke of lost loves and broken bones. Just as Magnar was beginning to sing, a sure sign that he was slipping deeply into intoxication, a shadow was cast by 2 figures standing behind the table.
Excuse me, may I have a word with you?
Magnus turned around to see the 2 elves he had noticed when he'd first walked in. The one speaking had slicked back hair that was a deep red, almost mahogany. Magnus could see a leather jerkin sticking out beneath his black cloak. The female elf, who was staring at the fire and didn't appear to notice her companion was speaking to anyone, was now much more covered up, wearing a dark green cloak. Magnus gestured for the elves to sit across from them, and they quickly sat down. The one all in black got the attention of the barmaid and quickly ordered more pints. I am Telric, and this is my cousin Valric, but most call her Val, the dark-haired elf said. Magnus introduced his brother and Keldos before asking, What is it that you needed to have words about exactly? Well, you 3 look like the kind of people who can solve problems and handle yourself, Telric said.
Not only can I handle myself, elf, I can handle 3 of the finest courtesans at the same time, Magnar replied. But if you're looking for someone to do your dirty work, you can look somewhere else. We aren't interested.
Magnus was surprised by how lucid his brother suddenly seemed. Oh, no, we aren't those types. I can assure you of that. We are looking for legitimate business partners, Telric said as he took his pint of ale from the arriving barmaid.
Well, we aren't the legitimate type either. We like to ride the line between legitimate and illicit. We appreciate the drinks, but I think you've misjudged us,
Magnar said while looking Telric in the eyes. Magnus felt that this was the kind of conversation to let his brother, even in his current state, lead. Magnar had far more experience with these types of propositions and affairs. Look, I believe it is you who has misjudged us. Would you at least allow me to explain? Telric quickly responded. Magnar gave an affirmative nod as he started packing tobacco into his pipe. Magnus looked at the female elf, the one supposedly called Val, and saw that she had finished her drink and appeared to be inspecting the mug, completely oblivious to the conversation and happening in front of her. My uncle, Varlock, owns the largest logging company in the Tameless Shore and is based here in Ridgeton. The city has recently commissioned the building of a wall around the city, and as I'm sure you've noticed, it currently stands incomplete. Telric took a large drink and then continued when he realized Magnar was not interrupting him. Well, Recently, 3 loggers went missing while out working for the day. My uncle has asked me to find some, let's say, discreet adventurers to track down these missing loggers. You know, the type that ride the line between legitimate and illicit, Tellerick said with a smile. Magnar lit his pipe and crossed his arms as he sat back.
3 missing loggers. I don't understand what the big deal is. Maybe they just decided logging wasn't for them.
Apparently, that is not thought to be the case. The other crews have refused to work until it is discovered what happened to their colleagues. My uncle is facing a total labor strike and potentially losing the contract with the city. He is willing to pay any who would help.
You're asking for aid from Keldos, legendary cleric of Syak,
Magnar responded while gesturing towards Keldos, who became wide-eyed and looked about to speak. Magnar, however, gave him no time to continue.
As well as the avowed wizard of Eldrin City, Magnus. Their aid does not come cheap. As for me, I'm just their muscle. I come cheaper, but I need a little more convincing.
My uncle is willing to pay 50 gold pieces a day to whoever is able to track down the missing loggers. Magnar took a long drag from his pipe and blew the smoke directly into the face of Tellerick.
Consider me convinced,
Magnar roared, before laughing loud enough that the entire tavern turned and looked at the table.
Let us toast to our newfound fellowship. Let us drink and be merry.
Everyone raised their mugs to the middle, except for Val, who suddenly stopped inspecting her empty mug and asked, "What are we toasting?" Magnar worked out the rest of the details with Tellerick, and the 2 elves departed shortly after. Keldos retired to his rooms for the night after having one last drink with the brothers. Magnar continued ordering mugs of ale, and everything became a slow blur into darkness for Magnus. He awoke the next morning to Magnar sitting on the edge of his bed.
Ah, brother, about the time you're awake. It is almost time to meet our new elf friends, though I can't find that small-eared one you brought along.
Magnus sat up in his bed, his vision still slightly blurred from his overindulgence the night before. Magnar turned towards his brother and pushed a sausage into his face.
Here, eat this, and let us leave this place.
Magnus's stomach burned with an arcane fury that he released immediately into his bedpan. End of Chapter 1. The Ridgeton Tales is a collaborative web serial written by D.M. Sanders, Ciaran Michael Sullivan, and Ian Oliver. All rights reserved. This is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents either are products of the author's imaginations or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual events, locales, or persons, living or dead, is entirely coincidental. For more information about the authors, including blogs, biographical material, and individual works, please visit our website at www.3dragonsmedia.com. A written transcript of this episode is also available for free on our website. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.